Okay, my turn. So I've got a move of 20. So I'll go 1, 2, 3, 19, 20. All right, now let's see if I'm in range. I've got a range of 20. So I got 1, 2, 3, 13, 14, 15, 16. There's got to be a better way to do this. All right, let's try that again. All right, we got a move of 20. So we can go 10, 20. All right, and a range of 20. So we've got 10, 20 in range. I still feel like we can do better. All right, I've got a move of 3. 1, 2, 3. Target is in range. Let's attack. Greetings, Realm Lords, Core Bricks here, and today we're going to talk about spaces. So in any miniature game, you have to move your armies, you have to move your miniatures around the field. And then we need some sort of a system to move them. Circle of Realms, certainly no exception to that. And as my intro showed, I didn't always use the system that I use today. So originally, in my earliest versions of Core, we literally would just count the individual pegs on the board. And then it took me a little while, but like a year or so later, I reinvented the ruler, and I put together these little peg sticks, which are just sticks of 30 pegs. Basically, it's like using a ruler to move your people around the battlefield. A lot like how Warhammer does. A lot of tabletop games with miniatures use a system kind of like this. But I figured since I'm making a whole board myself, or since I've made an entire board myself, then why am I going to like resort to using this? Using rulers and a peg stick like this has always struck me as a little bit awkward because you're constantly measuring things off, you're constantly counting different pegs, you're always lining things up and double checking them, and sometimes like you and someone else are like getting in an argument over whether or not something is actually in range of something or not. And it's just a little bit annoying. So what I decided to do was I was like, well, I've got my own board. I'll make spaces actually. I'll make actual spaces defined on the game board. Kind of like the old game Heroscape had. Heroscape was my first kind of like foray into miniature gaming, and I really liked the space system that it had, and I wanted to bring that over because it feels so polished, so refined. And when you're moving things on spaces, when you're counting out range on spaces, it doesn't take very long. You can do it very, very quickly. You can wrap up a turn like that, and you can get back onto the next person. Of course, there are drawbacks to using spaces. I have to actually have spaces all over my game board to do it, and the movement just isn't quite as precise as it would be if we were counting off like individual pegs or centimeters or something like that. But I find that the trade-off for like the fun and playability of the game is well worth it. Of course, I know that many of you guys down in the comments below have left comments before talking about games that you're making or have made and are playing, and a lot of you mentioned using rulers or some system like that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that system. I used that system for a while. I loved it. My friends loved it. We just preferred the space system, and so we moved to that. As always, of course, I'm eager to hear what you guys have to say. If you like using space systems, or if you really like measuring things off, if there's something I'm missing about what I'm talking about, if there's an advantage to the system that you really enjoy, let me know down in the comments below, or let me know what you think drawbacks are that I'm missing. If you've come up with a totally different system of movement, let me know that too. I'm always interested in hearing other ideas that people have come up with. With that said, let's go ahead and take a look at how I handle spaces in the Circle of Realms. Spaces can have two relationships to each other. A space can either be adjacent or neighboring. An adjacent space is a space that shares an edge with another space. So for example, if we have Prince Jalen standing here, the adjacent spaces are going to be the white spaces that form that kind of cross around him. Neighboring spaces, on the other hand, are any spaces that are within 6 pegs of another space. So all of those adjacent spaces are considered neighboring, but also the diagonal spaces, so these yellow spaces next to Jalen, are considered neighboring as well. Whenever you're measuring a unit's range or movement, it's going to be measured by neighboring spaces. So you can shoot diagonally, you can move diagonally. But if a unit only has a range of 0, then they can only attack figures that are on adjacent spaces. So if we actually go back to that fight between Jalen and the Snake Mercenary, Jalen actually cannot attack this mercenary in his current position because the mercenary is diagonal from him. He's on a neighboring space. He is not on an adjacent space. On the other hand, our mercenary has this great spear, and that does have a range of 1. So our mercenary is free to attack Jalen from that position. Now, a couple other things for measuring movement and range. There are some large units in the Circle of Realms, like big ships and stuff, that have spaces on top of them. If these units are moving around the battlefield, their spaces won't necessarily always line up perfectly with the grid of spaces underneath them, and that's totally fine. When you are transitioning between spaces that are on different surfaces like this, you've got spaces on a unit and you've got spaces on the game field, any space that is within 6 pegs of another space is considered to be adjacent to that space, not just neighboring, but adjacent. This is just to make everyone's lives, a little bit easier when you're playing the game. I don't want to make things too complicated. I hate having to pull out little peg sticks and measure things all the time if we can avoid it. And I don't want to have to worry about ooh, is he in front of the figure? Is he diagonal from the figure? If they're on different surfaces, if the spaces are within 6 pegs, then they are considered adjacent. So in this position, for example, Jalen can attack this Shadow Conscript, even though the Shadow Conscript looks like he's a little bit diagonal from him. Totally fine. They can still attack each other in melee combat. Generally speaking, when you are putting a unit down on the field, they should be at the center of the space that they are standing on. If that's not possible, if there's a big ship or something that's covering up part of the space, like here, then you can still slip your figure in onto the space as long as they can physically fit anywhere on it. If the space is completely covered though, then a unit can't go onto it. Hey my friends, if you're enjoying this video, please hit that like button. And if you're not already subscribed, go ahead and subscribe if you're interested in seeing more about the Circle of Realms, if you want to learn about how we play the rest of this game, because we're not going to get through all of it today. Let's see, what are some other rules about moving? Oh yes, a unit can't move through a spot they can't physically fit in. So if Jalen wants to climb through this window, that's a big no-no. He's got to find another way to get into that building. And while he's trying to figure that out, if we turn over to his father, King Mateo, we can see a different situation where Mateo wants to move up onto this wagon that is next to him. He can totally do that, but if you're moving more than 2 pegs up vertically between 2 surfaces, then you're going to have to subtract another move to get up it. So if you're moving more than 2 pegs vertically, then it's going to cost 2 moves to move between the spaces, not just 1 move. It's important to keep in mind that this applies to distance between 2 surfaces, not distance between 2 spaces. So in this situation, King Mateo can move up for just 1 space. Even though the space is more than 2 pegs higher than him, the only gap he ever has to move up getting up it is these little 1 space gaps from every step on the staircase. That's totally fine. It's going to cost 1 move to move up that staircase. Now, of course, say there's no staircase, if we want to move up a very high distance, any situation where a unit wants to move up to a higher surface that is taller than the height of the unit, then they just can't do it. It's not possible for a unit to climb up to a space that is above the top of their head. So King Mateo is going to have to find another way around if he wants to get up onto this little cliff from where he's standing. Now on the flip side, when going down, you don't have to worry about any of this stuff. If you want to move down and there's an elevation difference, it's not going to impact your ability to move there. However, if a unit's going to move their full height or greater down between 2 surfaces, then that unit is going to take some fall damage. And how that works is for every full height the unit falls down, then they're going to take 2 wounds of fall damage. So if King Mateo jumps down from this cliff, he can do it, he's going to take 2 damage. This isn't typically the end of the world, although do keep in mind, you can get to much higher elevations in the Circle of Realms, and so that damage can be quite significant if you fall off, especially for a non-hero unit that only has 10 health to lose. Now, returning to Prince Jalen, there's a few other things I want to talk about with movement. I know I said that a unit can't move through anywhere they can't physically fit. They also can't normally move anywhere they can't physically stop. So if there's space, a gap in elevation kind of between where a unit's standing and where they want to go, they normally can't necessarily make it there. But if we look at where Prince Jalen is standing here, a unit can do something that is called a leap. And if a unit leaps, then they spend 2 movement instead of 1 to move 5 pegs in a straight line. This would allow Jalen to jump from the siege tower he's on onto the wall that is in front of him. Additionally, I've got a lot of ladders in my game that units can climb up and down. Ladders are typically connected to what I call transit pads. A transit pad is any 2x2 plate with only a single stud on top. That way you know it's a transit pad. Transit pads connect flat surfaces to ladders. So if we look in this picture, we have a Shadow Conscript standing on a transit pad, and we've got Prince Jalen climbing up a ladder. These two spaces are linked. What that means is it only costs one move to move between the ladder and the transit pad. You can freely move between them even if your character isn't tall enough to normally make that move. And these spaces are considered adjacent, and your characters are considered to have line of sight on each other between these transit paths. So even though Prince Jalen is basically looking at the ladder that he's climbing up, he can still see and attack the shadow construct that's standing up above him on the transit pad. Now, like I said before, there are a lot of units that other units can stand on top of. A good example of this would be a horse. So Prince Jalen can, during his movement, climb up onto the horse and stand on it. If he does that though, just keep in mind he is traveling more than 2 pegs up, so he's gonna have to climb into that saddle. That's gonna cost him 2 move instead of 1 to climb into the saddle. Once a unit is standing on top of another unit, then whenever that other unit moves, the unit standing on top of it moves with him. The unit basically treats it like a space that's moving on the battlefield. So Jalen can, in 1 turn, climb up onto the horse, and then in that same turn, we can give a unit command to the horse to then walk away with Jalen on top of him. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in this video is flying. To do this, I'm going to have to turn over to this cultist unit instead of Prince Jalen, because Prince Jalen, quite frankly, does not have wings. A unit with flight like this cultist soldier can sacrifice either the movement portion of their turn or the last final action of their turn to either take off or land on the battlefield. When a unit takes off, then they are replaced with a micro figure or some sort of a micro representation of themselves. Once they are in the air, you can still move them just as you normally would. So we can freely move this cultist soldier through the sky as they are flying, but they are basically on a completely separate plane from everyone who is down on the actual Earth. So what this means is units on the ground cannot attack the figure that is flying, and units that are flying cannot attack the figure that is on the ground. Units with flight also never take fall damage when they fall down in elevation. This basically means that units that are flying in the sky are completely safe from units on the ground, and units on the ground are completely safe from units on the sky. But if you've got multiple units that are flying, like say, for example, we've got Crane flying over here, he's represented by this little bat, and we've still got our cultist soldier. Our cultist soldier can fly over to Crane and attack him, even though they're both not really on the field. They are still both flying in the sky, and they're next to each other in the air if their figures are within range of each other. When units are flying, we do not really care about line of sight. We don't care about elevation difference between the figures. We are assuming that if they are on neighboring spaces on the battlefield down below, then those figures are right next to each other up in the air when they are fighting. All right, that just about wraps up spaces. As always, if you'd like to see a more in-depth breakdown of this, or you want to kind of read through the rules at your own pace, you can check all of this out at www.circleofrealms.com. If you head over to the guide page, you can see everything I just said here laid out in a rulebook format. Other than that, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Next time we'll be looking at the different terrain types. So you can actually see what the difference between these different spaces is for units. Until then, be happy, be healthy, be well, and I will see you next time in the Circle of Realms.